The candlelight flickered across the grand hall of the Butler mansion, where silk dresses swept the polished floors and violins played to disguise the growing unease. Guests who had arrived smiling and flushed with wine were now paling, clutching their chests, coughing into perfumed handkerchiefs. One man collapsed beside the punch bowl, his legs trembling as though the floor itself rejected him. A woman gasped mid-laugh, her voice cutting into a ragged wheeze before she sank against her partner's shoulder. And in the shadows, unseen by all, Sukey the seamstress watched with unblinking eyes, her hands folded calmly as if she were praying. But her prayers had been stitched long ago, not with words but with poisoned threads that now danced across the ballroom in silence, pulling guests down like marionettes with strings cut loose. Every cough, every fainting spell, every shudder of weakness was a note in the symphony she had composed with needle and venom. The butlers themselves stood bewildered, their power unraveling before their eyes, their legacy rotting in real time. Yet Sukey remained still, her secret unspoken, her fate hanging by a single thread, because when the master's gaze finally turned toward her, suspicion blazing in his eyes, the true danger began. What had led her here? How had a quiet seamstress, owned and forgotten, brought a house of wealth and cruelty to its knees with nothing but cloth and craft? That story begins long before this night, and it will take you into the shadows of 1859 Memphis, where vengeance was stitched one secret thread at a time. If you're already hooked by this tale, make sure to like this story and subscribe, because what you're about to hear will only get darker. The needle was her prison. Each morning, before the first light cracked through the swollen skies of Memphis, Sukey was handed her tools with the same cold certainty that chains were clasped around ankles in the fields. She sat by the tall windows of the Butler mansion, her fingers moving with a precision that astonished even her owners. And yet there was no pride in her craft, only the crushing weight of knowing that every stitch she made carried someone else's vanity, someone else's wealth, someone else's comfort. The fabrics that passed through her lap were not meant for her world. They shimmered with imported dyes, heavy silks that whispered of European ports and fortunes made from cotton, picked by hands like hers, hands blistered, bleeding, and invisible. To the family, she was not Sukey, but simply the seamstress, a tool as silent as the needle she held. But the needle was also a mirror. As she bent over garments, watching the thread glide in and out, she could not stop imagining how that sharp, glinting point could pierce deeper, could sink past fabric into flesh, could carry something far more dangerous than thread. It was a thought she swallowed quickly, because even in silence the house had ears, and thoughts of rebellion were as perilous as open defiance. Still, the image lingered. Every prick of her finger, every drop of blood staining the cloth, became a reminder that her life was being drained stitch by stitch, day after day. The Butler mansion itself was a monument to cruelty veiled in grandeur. Chandeliers glittered above rooms that smelled of beeswax and bourbon. Portraits of stern ancestors glaring down from paneled walls, as though daring anyone to question the dynasty they represented. But beyond the polished floors and velvet curtains lay the truth. The Butler Empire thrived on suffering. In the fields, men and women bent their backs until their spines groaned. In the kitchens, children worked until their hands grew raw. Whippings were delivered not for crimes but for reminders. Reminders that ownership was absolute, and mercy was a foreign tongue. And while others bore the scars of lash and shackle, Sukey bore a quieter torment. Condemned to labor for beauty, she could never claim. The mistress of the house, Mrs. Butler, treated her creations as trophies. Each gown Sukey completed was paraded before gatherings of Memphis society, praised by women who would never lower their hands to sew a single button. "Our seamstress is truly gifted," Mrs. Butler would say with a smile, her voice dripping with condescension, as if Sukey were no more than a pet trained to perform tricks. And Sukey, her head bowed, would bite down the rising bile, knowing that gratitude was demanded of her, even as her labor stole her youth. The master, Mr. Butler, saw her talent in terms of profit. He loaned out her services to neighbors for fees that never touched her hands, turning her skill into another cog in the machine of his wealth. Men like him believed themselves eternal, unshakable, their fortunes guaranteed by the soil and the sweat of the enslaved. To him, Sukey's nimble hands were simply another form of currency. But as she worked late into the nights, her lamp flickering, in the silence, she began to see the irony of it all. The very tool that chained her might also one day free her. What unsettled Sukey most was the growing awareness that the fabric itself seemed to absorb more than her thread. As she stitched, she whispered into her work, not words anyone else could hear, but the unspoken prayers of her ancestors. Her mother, long gone, had told her that blood and thread were not so different. They bound, they healed, they carried power. And so each garment became a vessel, a silent diary of rage and longing. She imagined the dresses wrapping around the mistress like a snake, the coats tightening around the master until his breath came ragged. Though she dared not act, yet the visions grew sharper, like an unseen hand guiding her toward something inevitable. Still, danger pressed on all sides. The Butler home was not a place of privacy. Every corridor held eyes. Every shadow concealed ears eager to carry whispers back to the master. Even her moments of stillness at the sewing table were monitored, the overseers quick to remind her that she belonged to the house, that her skill did not grant her freedom but only deepened her chains. Yet even chains could be reshaped. Metal rusted, fabric frayed, and secrets could be sewn into seams invisible to the proud, but clear to the desperate. The nights in the quarters only fed her resolve. As she returned from the mansion, walking, past the flickering fires of her people, she heard the murmurs rise like smoke into the air. They spoke of old rebellions, of men who vanished into swamps, and women who poisoned their captors with meals seasoned not with herbs, but with hatred. Around those fires, history lived not in books but in whispers, passed from lips cracked with exhaustion into the ears of the next generation. Sukey listened, her needle-heavy hands trembling with a new awareness. She was not alone. She was part of a lineage of quiet wars, battles fought not with armies but with cunning, patience, and silence. And so the needle in her hand no longer seemed just a chain. It became a possibility. Every stitch she made was practice, every pattern a rehearsal, for a role she had yet to play. Though she sat in the golden cage of the Butler mansion, the vision of what could be grew sharper. She began to wonder not if she could act, but when, and with what weapon hidden within her craft. For in a world where the overseer's whip could silence the strongest voice, perhaps vengeance itself needed to be sewn, thread by thread, into the very clothes of the oppressors. The thought rooted itself deeply, so deeply that it could no longer be ignored. The next time she pricked her finger and a bead of blood swelled at the tip, she pressed it into the fabric and whispered to herself, too softly for anyone to hear. It was not just cloth she stitched, it was fate. And in the distance, faint but steady, the murmurs of the quarters rose again, carrying stories that would guide her further down a path she could no longer turn away from. Stories of whispers, of secrets, of poisons hidden where no one dared to look. The night carried a different weight beyond the mansion walls. In the quarters, where wooden shacks leaned against each other like weary bodies, the air was heavy with the smell of smoke, sweat, and soil. It was here, when the Butler family's laughter had faded into drunken silence and the overseers retired to their cabins, that voices rose from the embers of the fire. Low, careful voices, weaving stories that had no place in the daylight. Sukey sat among them, her needle calluses pressed together as though she could stitch the very words into her skin, her eyes catching the flicker of firelight that danced over faces lined with hardship yet fierce with something deeper. Memory. They spoke of the ones who had come before, of those who had been chained and sold, beaten and broken, but who refused to surrender their last weapon, cunning. One elder, his back crooked from decades of toil, told of a woman who had stirred powders into her master's stew until his lips turned blue and his voice shriveled to silence. Another spoke of a man who laced tobacco with herbs so bitter that his owner wasted away, consumed not by bullets or blades but by something invisible. something no one could trace. These were not tales of open revolt, not stories of armies rising in defiance. They were whispers of quiet wars, of deaths written off as sickness, of vengeance hidden in the fabric of daily life. Sukey listened with a stillness that belied the storm rising within her. Each word felt like a secret hand guiding her needle, showing her that rebellion did not always roar. It could whisper. It could linger in the unseen places, in a cup of water, in a bite of bread, in a stitch so fine no eye could trace it. The elders spoke of Africa, of spirits who had followed them across the ocean, guardians that watched even in the darkest corners of the plantations. They spoke of roots that healed and roots that killed, of leaves that could soothe fever or silence breath. Knowledge carried in fragments, half lost to time but clung to like embers, waiting for someone brave enough to fan them into flame. Sukey's heart pounded as she realized that her hands were not bound to sewing alone. They could gather, they could mix, they could wield what the land itself offered. And unlike others who cooked under watchful eyes, her work was unseen, her tools ordinary. Who would suspect a seamstress of carrying anything more than needles and thread? Her position, cursed as it was, might also be her cloak, but even in whispers, danger pressed close. A sudden crack of footsteps in the dirt could turn stories into silence. One night, as the fire burned low, the overseer's shadow fell across the circle, his whip coiled at his side. Conversation snapped into stillness, the elders bowing their heads as though they had been praying. Sukey lowered her eyes too, though. Her blood roared in her ears. For a moment she thought the overseer had heard, that he would demand to know what words they had dared to share. But after a long, suspicious glare, he moved on, his boots grinding the earth, leaving the fire to crackle nervously in his absence. It was a reminder that every whisper was a risk, every secret balanced on the edge of discovery. And yet the whispers endured. They endured because they had to. For people denied the right to write their histories, stories became the only inheritance. Sukey carried them back with her to the mansion, rolling them through her mind as she stitched gowns for the mistress, coats for the master, uniforms for the children. The fabric seemed to hum with the voices of the elders, urging her forward. With every dress she finished, she felt as though she were rehearsing for something greater, something that would one day turn the mansion's glittering halls into a stage for her vengeance. She began to dream in whispers too. At night she would wake with the taste of soil on her tongue, the image of roots and herbs swirling in her mind, visions of threads that tightened around necks, seams that carried sickness into the skin of her oppressors. Her dreams were not nightmares. They were rehearsals, the spirit world itself teaching her what the living dared only to hint at. When she woke, her hands trembled not from fear but from the weight of possibility. Still, possibility alone was not enough. Dreams had to become knowledge. Whispers had to become instructions. And Sukey, though careful, began to seek it. She lingered near the elders after others had gone, her questions cloaked in casual tones, her curiosity hidden behind the guise of youthful wonder. One old man, his face carved with scars older than she was, looked at her with eyes that seemed to pierce straight into her thoughts. He asked no questions of her motives, for he already knew. And one night, when the moon was thin and the fire low, he leaned close and told her of plants that grew wild at the edges of the Butler land, plants whose roots were bitter enough to end a man's life if taken the right way. His voice was barely audible, a rasp against the crackle of the fire, but to Sukey it thundered like prophecy. Her fate had been whispered to her in the darkness. The needle in her hand would no longer only stitch beauty for her oppressors. It would carry the voices of her ancestors, their knowledge hidden in its thread. What had been whispers around a fire would soon be woven into the very fabric of the Butler household. And so, with the weight of generations pressing against her heart, Sukey rose from the fire that night with her path set. The whispers had given her the map. Now she needed the tools, and the land itself, rich and dangerous, waited with answers buried beneath its roots. The land itself was alive with secrets. Beneath the fertile soil that fed the Butler's wealth, beneath the rows of cotton that swayed like an ocean under the Memphis sun. There grew roots and herbs that whispered of healing and death, in equal measure. Sukey began to look at the fields differently after that night by the fire. No longer were they only a place of labor and punishment. They were a hidden apothecary, their edges lined with knowledge older than chains, older than the plantation itself. She watched the ground as she walked between tasks, her eyes catching the curve of a leaf, the twist of a vine, the cluster of berries too bright to be harmless. It was the elder who guided her first steps. One evening, while shadows stretched long across the fields, he beckoned her away from the fire, leading her toward the darker edges of the land where the overseers rarely lingered. His voice was low, warning her of the danger not only in the plants themselves but in the act of gathering them. "The earth will give you what you seek," he whispered, "but take it wrong, and it will kill you before it kills them." His hands, gnarled and steady, pointed out small differences in leaves that could save a life or end it. A root that looked harmless could rot the gut. A flower that bloomed prettily could still the breath in minutes. He pressed a small bundle into her hand, wrapped in cloth so thin it felt like holding secrets themselves. "Learn their weight, learn their smell, learn what they do before you dare use them." Sukey's heart pounded as she carried the bundle back to the quarters, careful to keep it hidden from watchful eyes. Her body buzzed with both fear and exhilaration, for she knew that she had crossed a threshold. Her life until now had been bound by needle and thread, but with these roots and powders she now held the potential to alter the balance of power itself. She was no longer only a seamstress, she was becoming something far more dangerous. She began her lessons in silence. At night, when the quarters had fallen asleep, she would unroll the cloth and spread the herbs on the dirt floor of her corner. She memorized their shapes, rubbed their leaves between her fingers, inhaled their bitter aromas until she could recognize them blind. She whispered their names to herself, though they were not written in any book, names carried in breath and memory, syllables from tongues half forgotten. And when the opportunity arose, she tested them in the smallest of ways. Her first attempt came when she slipped a pinch of powder into scraps left for stray dogs that prowled the edges of the property. She watched from a distance as one of them sniffed, ate, and later staggered into the brush with labored breath. Sukey's stomach twisted at the sight, but she did not look away. She forced herself to witness every moment, to understand the weight of what she was doing. Death was not something she could treat lightly. It was a tool she had to wield with precision, and precision was something her needle hands already knew. Days turned into weeks as she grew bolder. She gathered more, careful to never take enough to draw suspicion. She tucked small pouches into the lining of her skirts, stitched tiny pockets into her work basket, where powders and leaves could hide in plain sight. Once, as she bent to collect a root near the hedges, she heard footsteps crunching the dirt behind her. Her blood froze. The overseer's shadow loomed, his eyes narrow with suspicion. For a moment, Sukey thought it was over, that the bundle hidden in her apron would be her undoing. But with quick thinking, she dropped to her knees and pretended to tie her shoe, her fingers trembling as they brushed over the very earth that threatened to betray her. The overseer grunted, spat into the dirt, and walked on, leaving her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she feared it would break through her chest. She carried the fear with her back to the mansion, but fear no longer paralyzed her. It sharpened her. Each close call reminded her that the price of discovery was death, a death designed to terrify others into obedience. But each close call also fueled her certainty that she was moving towards something greater than her own survival. Her knowledge grew, so did her vision. She began to see the fabric she handled daily not as garments but as vessels. If thread could carry wax for stiffening, it could carry powders too. If seams could be lined with padding, they could hide poison as well. Her mind began stitching, in secret, designing garments not for beauty, but for decay. The Butler family would wear their own destruction as if it were finery, yet she knew she was not ready. She needed proof, a trial, a moment to see her whispers take form before risking her life on something so vast. And so she waited, gathering, learning, perfecting. Her days were still filled with silk and scolding, with the sharp voice of Mrs. Butler demanding perfection, with the cruel eyes of Mr. Butler watching for weakness. But beneath her bowed head and quiet obedience, Sukey's mind burned with purpose, her hands aching not from labor, but from the weight of what they now knew. The mansion glittered with wealth, its rooms filled with perfumes and laughter. But Sukey could smell the bitterness of the roots even when they were hidden away. It clung to her, a secret perfume only she could sense, a constant reminder that she carried in her hands both life and death. And as she stitched another gown for the mistress, her fingers moving with mechanical grace, she whispered silently into the thread. Soon, she told herself, soon the needle would pierce more than cloth. Soon the roots of the land would crawl up through the seams of the Butler family's world, and the first garment to carry that promise was already waiting to be born. The moment could no longer be delayed. For weeks, Sukey had carried her secret poisons in tiny pouches stitched into her skirts, powders so fine they clung to her fingertips, roots so bitter their taste lingered in her mouth long after she tested them on her tongue. She had studied, practiced, and risked discovery more times than she dared count. Now the silence of preparation had grown unbearable. The needle in her hand trembled with hunger, and she knew that the first true stitch had to be made, or the fire burning inside her would consume her from within. It began with the smallest of experiments, cloaked in the disguise of duty. Sukey was asked to mend a servant's apron, a task so trivial the mistress hardly bothered to notice. As she worked, she rubbed a faint dusting of powder along the inside hem, where it would brush against skin. Her heart raced with every stitch, her throat tight with the knowledge that she was crossing a threshold that could never be undone. She handed the apron back as though nothing had changed, her expression calm, her voice low, her hands steady. For days she watched the servant, girl from afar, waiting for some sign, some faltering of breath, some weakness in her steps. But nothing came. The dose had been too light, the poison too diluted. Sukey swallowed her disappointment with a bitter clarity. The needle had not failed her. She had failed the needle, so she grew bolder. Her next attempt came with a shirt belonging to one of the younger Butler boys, a spoiled child who often tugged at her skirts, demanding she fix the buttons he deliberately tore. Into the lining of the collar she rubbed a stronger mixture, her hands working with such precision that no eye could have traced it. For days she lingered, watching as the boy wore the shirt, her pulse quickening each time he scratched at his neck, each cough that rattled from his throat. But children are resilient, and though he grew feverish for a night, by morning he was running through the halls again, his laughter sharp and cruel. Sukey clenched her jaw as she sewed another garment, realizing that vengeance was not a single stitch but a tapestry. Patience would be her thread, persistence her pattern. The test that followed was not by her choosing but by fate's. A stray cat, lean and sharp-eyed, had slipped into the workroom one night, pawing at scraps of cloth she had dusted with powder. By morning, the animal lay stiff near the back steps, its body curled in unnatural stillness. Sukey stood over it, her breath caught between triumph and dread. The proof she had craved was before her. Her hands could kill, yet the sight of the small, broken creature struck her deeper than she had expected. She forced herself to remember. This was only the beginning, a rehearsal for a stage far greater. If her heart trembled now, how would it endure when the Butlers themselves wore her poisoned seams? But there was no turning back. The more she tested, the sharper her resolve became. She adjusted her mixtures, altered her methods, perfecting the balance between strength and subtlety. She learned how to blend powders into the wax used to stiffen thread, how to conceal them in padding invisible to the eye. She stitched her fury into fabric as though she were practicing a new language, one spoken not with words but with sickness. Every garment became a question whispered into the dark. What would happen if they wore this? How long would it take before the poison revealed itself? And with each question came risk. One evening, as she leaned over her work, the mistress herself entered unexpectedly, her sharp eyes scanning the room. Sukey froze, her fingers trembling against the cloth, the faint bitterness of the powders still clinging to her skin. For a heartbeat, she thought the game was over, that Mrs. Butler would demand to see the fabric, to know why it smelled faintly of earth and rot. But the mistress only sneered, chastising her for working too slowly before sweeping out of the room with a rustle of silk. Sukey exhaled in silence, her body weak with relief. The needle had nearly betrayed her, and yet it had held. What haunted her most were the nights in the quarters, when her people laughed or prayed around the fires, unaware of the storm she was sowing in secret. She wanted to tell them, to share the weight of her plan, but trust was too fragile and ears too dangerous. So she carried it alone, her silence stitched as tightly as her seams. Yet even in silence, she could feel the whispers of the ancestors pressing closer, as if watching each stitch, guiding her hands. The turning point came not with a servant or a child, but with a commission from the mistress herself. Mrs. Butler, vain and eager to display her wealth, demanded a new gown for an upcoming dinner, one that would shimmer under candlelight and silence her rivals in envy. Sukey's hands shook not with fear, but with anticipation as she laid out the fabric, knowing this was the moment she had been preparing for. Into the lining of the bodice she worked her most careful mixture yet, blending poison into the very wax that stiffened the thread. Each stitch was a quiet strike, each pull of the needle a silent vow. When the night of the dinner arrived, the house glowed with polished brass and flickering candles, the air rich with roasted meats and sweet tobacco. Guests filled the hall with laughter, their voices echoing beneath the chandelier's glow. Sukey stood in the shadows, her gaze fixed on the mistress as she swept into the room in the poisoned gown, her head high, her lips curved in self-satisfied pride. The seamstress's heart pounded, her body rigid with the weight of what she had done. And then, as the music swelled and the wine flowed, the first cough cracked through the air. The cough was faint at first, so small it might have been swallowed by the music. Yet to Sukey's ears it cracked like a gunshot. Mrs. Butler raised a lace-gloved hand to her lips, dabbing delicately as though it were no more than an irritation. The guests continued their chatter. The violins played, the silverware clinked against porcelain, but Sukey's heart thundered in her chest. She stood in the corner of the hall, her body half hidden behind a column, her eyes fixed on the mistress, in the gown that shimmered like moonlight. Every bead of sweat on her palms, every tremor in her breath was tethered to the fabric she had stitched, the fabric now wrapped tightly against her captor's skin. As the dinner progressed, Mrs. Butler's cough returned, sharper, more insistent. Her cheeks flushed, her fingers fumbled with her glass of wine. A gentleman at her side leaned closer with concern, but she brushed him off with an impatient wave, unwilling to let weakness disturb her evening of vanity. Sukey watched, her lips pressed so tightly together that they burned. Each cough was a thread tightening around the mistress's throat, each falter a stitch pulling the poison deeper into her flesh. And yet nothing dramatic came. No collapse, no sudden gasp, only a slow unraveling, a sickness quiet enough to be ignored by those too absorbed in their own indulgence. Sukey slipped back into the workroom that night, her mind a storm of questions. Had she miscalculated again? Was the dose too weak? The poison too subtle? Or was this what vengeance looked like? Not in fire and blood, but in a slow, creeping decay that ate away at its victim unseen. She pressed her hands to her face, her fingers still reeking faintly of the bitter roots, and whispered to herself in the silence, reminding herself that patience was as much a weapon as poison. Over the following days, the evidence grew undeniable. Mrs. Butler's strength withered. Her skin lost its glow, her eyes sank into dark hollows. Her appetite faded until even the richest dishes made her nauseous. She complained of headaches, of fatigue, of fevers that burned in waves through her body. The house called for doctors, men in fine coats carrying leather satchels, their arrogance dripping as heavily as the sweat on their brows. They declared it a passing illness, a seasonal fever, a weakness of the nerves, prescribing tinctures of alcohol and powders of chalk that did nothing to ease her suffering. Sukey moved through the house like a shadow, silent and obedient, but inside she burned with a terrible satisfaction. She kept her eyes lowered, never lingering too long, but she saw it all: the mistress's trembling hands, the restless nights, the whispered worries behind closed doors. The poison had worked. It was slow, yes, but it was steady, and the sickness was hers alone. The others in the house were untouched. The gown had carried its curse only to the body it was meant for, and that precision filled Sukey with a grim pride. But pride was dangerous. Pride drew attention, and attention in the Butler mansion was death. Mr. Butler, sharp-eyed and quick to suspicion, began to notice the way Sukey lingered near the doorway, the way her silence seemed heavier than the others. He had always watched her, had always understood that her talent made her different from the rest. Now, as his wife's health faltered, his gaze hardened on her like the strike of a whip. One evening, as the mistress lay shivering in her bed, Mr. Butler entered the sewing room without warning. Sukey's hands froze over her work, her needle glinting in the lamplight. He asked her what she was sewing, why she worked so late, why her face looked pale. His questions were not spoken in curiosity but in accusation. The words coiled with threat. Sukey bowed her head, her voice steady though her stomach churned, and answered as she always had, with obedience, with silence polished into submission. After a long, tense pause, he left, but not without glancing at the basket of threads and fabrics with a suspicion that sent cold fire down her spine. That night, as she lay in her narrow bed in the quarters, Sukey stared into the dark, her body rigid. The taste of victory lingered, but so did the sharp edge of danger. She had proven her craft could kill, but the cost of discovery had grown sharper with every cough that escaped the mistress's lips. She was dancing on a thread stretched thin, each step risking a fall that would end not just her life, but perhaps the lives of all who shared whispers around the fire. And yet, as dawn crept over the horizon, Sukey rose with a clarity stronger than fear. The gown had worked. The poison had spoken. She had begun a war sewn into silence, and she would not stop now. For every cough from the mistress, she heard the voices of her ancestors louder, urging her forward, reminding her that patience was not weakness, but power waiting to strike again. And as Mr. Butler's suspicions sharpened, as Overseer's eyes turned more closely toward her, Sukey knew the game had shifted. She was no longer invisible. The house itself had begun to breathe down her neck. Every step she took, every stitch she made, every glance she held too long, carried the weight of risk. She had tasted what vengeance could be, and now she had to walk a line between triumph and ruin. Because Mrs. Butler was sickening, yes, but Sukey was the one being hunted. The mistress of the house was unraveling, but the unraveling came slowly, silently, like a thread being pulled from the inside of a garment until the whole began to sag and sag without notice. Mrs. Butler had always carried herself with a sharp pride, her posture rigid, her voice laced with venomous sweetness, but now she moved through the house as though wading through water. Her steps faltered on the stairs. Her hands shook when she lifted a teacup. At night, her coughing fits tore through the walls, echoing across the silent halls of the mansion, until even the servants in their corners stirred awake with unease. Yet in daylight, the facade persisted. She forced rouge onto her pale cheeks, forced laughter into her voice, forced herself to sit at the head of the table though her hands trembled against the silver. The Butler family was a monument to appearances, and weakness was not permitted to show. But no amount of powder or perfume could mask what Sukey saw. She saw the way the mistress's breath grew shallow, the way her skin took on the gray tint of candle wax, the way her appetite shrank until plates of food returned untouched. Each detail was a thread in Sukey's private tapestry of vengeance, each moment a sign that her silent weapon was still working, still sowing decay into the body of her oppressor. The doctors came and went, men with gleaming watches and arrogant words. They prescribed rest, tonics, leeches, powders mixed into wine. They argued among themselves about humors and nerves, never daring to admit ignorance in front of the master who demanded answers. But none of their remedies touched the sickness, for the sickness did not come from the air or the blood or the stars. It came from Sukey's hands, from the threads that carried whispers of the earth itself. And so the doctors left, muttering about a lingering fever, their satchels lighter, their pockets heavier, while Mrs. Butler continued to wither beneath, the silks and pearls she clung to like armor. Sukey moved quietly through this storm, her face a mask of obedience, but inside she was alive with a terrible knowledge. She had done this. She, the seamstress slave who stitched without voice or name, had reached into the heart of the house and planted decay. And no one could see it. No one suspected the needle. Her invisibility, once her cage, had become her shield. She felt the ancestors in her blood, whispering strength through her veins, reminding her that silence could be louder than screams if wielded with patience. But patience carried its own dangers. The slower the mistress declined, the more restless the master became. Mr. Butler prowled the halls at night like a restless beast, his temper snapping at servants, his voice booming with rage at doctors and overseers alike. And in the corners of his anger, his gaze fell too often on Sukey. He saw her stillness as cunning, her silence as calculation. Where others saw only a seamstress bent over her work, he saw something else, something he could not yet name but feared nonetheless. Sukey felt the eyes on her, sharp as knives. When she carried fabric through the hall, she sensed footsteps behind her. When she bent over her work basket, she felt shadows leaning too close. One afternoon, as she walked back from the well with a pitcher of water, a capataz stepped from the path and blocked her way, his eyes narrowing on the bulge of her apron where a pouch of roots lay hidden. Her breath caught. For a moment, the earth tilted beneath her feet, but with steady hands she shifted the pitcher, letting the cloth fall to disguise the pouch, and bowed her head low. The capataz spat into the dirt, muttered something crude, and stepped aside. Sukey walked on, her steps even though her legs trembled. The game was tightening, and one misstep would cost her more than her own life. What tormented her most was not the suspicion, but the silence she was forced to carry. She could not share her triumph with anyone. She could not whisper to the elders, could not let the fire circle know that the whispers had borne fruit. If she confessed, even in pride, it could mean betrayal, whether intentional or forced. So, she sewed her secret deeper into her heart, her eyes betraying nothing as she watched the mistress grow weaker by the day. But at night, when she lay awake listening to the coughing echo through the mansion, she allowed herself the smallest of smiles in the dark. The house itself began to shift under the weight of invisible sickness. Servants moved nervously, unsure how to serve a mistress who could no longer command with certainty. Guests whispered about her absence from gatherings, speculation dripping from their lips like wine. And still the butlers tried to maintain the illusion of control, as if appearances could stave off the truth unraveling within their walls. But appearances could not hide the stench of sickness. They could not disguise the tremor in Mrs. Butler's voice, the way her jewelry seemed to hang heavier against her hollowed collarbones. Sukey knew the next step was coming, the inevitable moment when her position would no longer allow her to simply watch. The master's suspicion was growing, and the household eyes were turning sharper, hungrier for someone to blame. And as the mistress's decline became impossible to ignore, that blame would not fall on doctors or fate. It would fall on the invisible seamstress who had always been there, always silent, always stitching in the shadows. She had set the wheel in motion, but wheels once turning cannot be stopped. The gown had spoken, the poison had whispered, and now the silence of the house was screaming with tension. Sukey's vengeance had begun to bear fruit, but vengeance was never harvested without risk. And now the question pressed upon her chest, heavier than any chain. Could she remain unseen long enough to finish what she had begun? Or would the master's gaze finally pierce the veil she had sewn around herself? The answer waited in the eyes that never left her, the eyes of a man who was beginning to see the shadow she cast in his house. Mr. Butler's eyes began to haunt the corridors before his footsteps did, a cold awareness that traveled ahead of him like a chill under a door. Sukey felt them at her back even when she worked alone, felt them when she bent over the fine silk, laid across her lap, felt them in the way the air seemed to thicken as if the house itself had learned to watch. He prowled with a patience that mocked her own, moving from room to room with his hands clasped behind him, pausing at doorways to study her posture, her breathing, the rhythm of her needle. She kept that rhythm steady and slow, the same obedient cadence she had perfected since girlhood, but each stitch now was threaded with calculation. He stood too close as she sewed a sleeve and she did not flinch. He asked her to repeat small tasks and she did so without complaint. He sent her down long corridors for trivial items, hoping to catch her hurried or rattled. And she returned with the same measured steps, her face as unyielding as carved wood. He did not strike her. He did not shout. His silence was the weapon. One afternoon he entered the sewing room without warning, then said nothing for so long that the ticking of the mantel clock became a cruel metronome. He glanced across the table where she sorted threads, examined the spools as if their colors could confess. Cotton, silk, wax. He touched everything lightly, fingertips grazing the rim of her work basket, the folded edge of a bodice, the smooth handle of her scissors. When he left, he did so without a word, but the door closed softly in a way that made her bones feel hollow. It was a promise. He had not found what he was looking for, but he would. The overseers took their cue and became shadows with boots. They lingered at the corners of the yard when Sukey crossed to the well. They strolled through the quarters, at odd hours pretending to check on leaky roofs or slanting steps, asking questions that were not questions at all. Had anyone seen the seamstress carrying something unusual? Did anyone notice any new plants growing near the hedges? Did anyone smell anything strange in the workrooms? Their tone was casual, but their eyes were hungry. The slightest tremor in an answer would be carried back to the master like a prize. Sukey said little and listened a great deal. She learned quickly that fear had a sound. It sounded like a breath held too long and released too fast, like a word cut short mid-syllable. She adjusted her movements as if she were being choreographed by the house itself. Pouches that had once been stitched into the lining of her skirts were now split among several hiding places so small a rat would have been inconvenienced. A loose board behind a wash basin. A hollow inside a broken spool where powder could cling in grains the eye would dismiss as lint. She rehearsed the path her hands would take if someone entered suddenly. She practiced dropping a folded cloth over a workpiece with a movement so fluid it would appear natural, just a seamstress shielding delicate fabric from dust. She even trained her expression to respond to surprise with a polite smile that did not reach her eyes. But precision can be exhausted by the constant drag of vigilance. Fatigue crept into her bones, a silent thief that made the night shorter and the day heavier. Twice she woke on the floor beside her cot, her cheek pressed to the boards where she had fallen asleep sitting up. Once she pricked her finger so deeply, she had to bite her tongue to keep from gasping. The tiny bead of blood swelled bright as a berry and dotted the fabric like an accusation. She blotted it with the corner of her apron, breathing through the surge of panic. The drop vanished into the cloth, but the lesson did not. She could not afford another misstep. Mr. Butler began to test her in ways that felt like games played by a cat that has not yet decided whether to kill. He asked her to fetch a bolt of muslin from a cabinet that she knew he had searched earlier. He requested a sampler from a drawer that he had left slightly open, the better to see whether she noticed his intrusion. He told another servant to carry one of her baskets across the hall, and then watched from a doorway as Sukey reached for it. Her fingers hovered for a fraction of a second longer than they should have, calculating the weight, listening for the shift of something hidden. He smiled with only one side of his mouth before walking away. It was not victory for him, not yet. It was appetite. The mistress's sickness deepened the pressure with every ragged breath. She called for Sukey more often now, not to sew, but to help dress her, to bring a shawl, to adjust a pillow. Each errand forced Sukey to step nearer to the body her work had been dissolving thread by thread, forced her to steady hands that wanted to tremble. The scent of rosewater clung to the bed linens, but beneath it lay the metallic tang of illness, a scent she had come to know in the animals she had tested and in her own fear. Once the mistress turned her face toward Sukey, and for a moment, the mask of pride fell. In her eyes, a thought flickered like a moth against a window. Recognition, perhaps, or the earliest formation of a question too terrible to speak. Then the mask slid back into place and she demanded the mirror. There was a day when the sky lowered like a bruise, and the house devoured its own light. Mr. Butler summoned everyone into the hall with a clap that cracked through the rooms. He spoke to the household in a voice cold enough to slow the blood. The mistress was unwell, he said, and this house would not tolerate carelessness or sin. He spoke of thieves of health that move in secret and of the price for treachery. He did not say the word poison. He did not have to. The word hung there, anyway heavy as lead. Sukey stood with the others, her chin lowered, her eyes at the level of polished shoes. She could feel the overseers taking note of every throat that swallowed too loudly, every nervous shift of weight. After that, the quarters lost their voice. The night fire still burned, but the stories fell into hiding, huddled under the tongue, where no ear could snatch them. People nodded to one another with looks that carried whole sentences. They prayed in whispers rather than song. Sukey felt the loneliness of her mission sink colder than winter water. She had always known she must carry this burden alone, knowing it was one thing, feeling it was another. She lay awake and counted breaths the way she counted stitches, measuring time as if her will could hold it steady. The next afternoon, something small and almost nothing became a spark. Sukey was in the workroom sorting threads when a white housemaid drifted in on an errand too vague to be believable. The girl lingered, fingers skimming the top of the table as if searching for dust she could blame on someone else. Her gaze landed on Sukey's sewing box, handsome in its plain way. The wood, dark with oil and years of handling. The maid smiled the kind of smile that asked for trouble, and lifted the lid without waiting to be asked. Sukey's breath stopped. Inside lay the harmless tools of her trade, or what would appear harmless at first glance. But woven among them was the faintest trace of a new waxed thread she had prepared the night before. The scent was not strong to an untrained nose. It was a sour earthiness, the echo of a root ground into powder and reborn as a sheen on string. The maid sniffed, her head tipping a fraction, curiosity sharpening into something that could cut. She leaned closer and the air seemed to hold its breath with Sukey. The girl's eyes narrowed. She was about to ask a question that would open the wrong door. The housemaid's hand lingered over the sewing box, her fingers grazing the waxed thread as though it were a ribbon meant for her amusement. Sukey's body tensed so tightly that her joints ached. The maid sniffed again, her nose wrinkling, and her lips parted as if she were about to speak, to release words that would fall into the air like knives. Time slowed in that instant. The crackle of the fire in the grate seemed louder. The tick of the clock thundered, and even the dust hanging in the sunbeam above the table appeared frozen. Sukey knew that if the girl asked, if she carried even the faintest suspicion back to the master, the chain of whispers would tighten into a noose around her neck. But Sukey's voice did not tremble when she spoke. She forced it soft and steady, almost weary, as though she were the one being interrupted. "Careful, miss," she said, lowering her eyes with practiced obedience. "That thread's coated with wax for stiffening. Stains hand something awful. Mistress don't like the look of it on the lace." The words fell like cloth over a mirror, hiding the truth in plain sight. The maid hesitated, her curiosity colliding with her fear of the mistress's sharp tongue. She pulled her hand back, frowning at the thought of staining her pale fingers. "Figures," she muttered, dropping the lid with a careless thud before sauntering out, leaving Sukey alone with the echo of her own heartbeat pounding like a drum. The relief was sharp but fleeting. Sukey knew the girl's suspicion had not died. It had only curled into a corner, waiting for another chance to crawl free. From that moment forward, every time the housemaid passed her in the hall, Sukey felt the weight of her glance, light as a feather yet sharp as a blade. It was not the overseer's whip that terrified her most, nor the master's narrowed eyes. It was the idle curiosity of a bored white girl who had nothing to lose and everything to gain by exposing her. That night, Sukey sat in the quarters with her hands clenched around her knees, staring at the floorboards while the murmurs of the others faded into the dark. She thought of the waxed thread hidden in her basket, thought of the way the maid's nose had twitched at the scent, and she realized the danger was no longer only in the needle. It was in the air itself. She could not afford mistakes, not with so many eyes around her. The poison had to become invisible even to those who breathed it in. So she changed her methods. She began to grind the roots finer, mixing them with beeswax until the bitterness of the earth was hidden beneath the faint sweetness of honey. She stitched late into the night, her lamp shielded, her fingers steady as she worked the new threads into patterns so delicate they seemed almost holy. To anyone else, the garments were perfect, each seam tight, each hem flawless. But to Sukey, every stitch was a blade sheathed in silk, a weapon disguised as ornament. Still, the risk gnawed at her. Every task became a trial, every interaction a test of balance. When the mistress asked her to adjust a hem while she coughed into a handkerchief spotted with blood, Sukey's hands brushed dangerously close to the fabric that carried the sickness she had sewn there. When the master summoned her to explain why a seam had taken so long, she stood inches from his fury, with the hidden knowledge that his household was already unraveling in her hands. And always, always she felt the maid's gaze circling like a hawk above, waiting to swoop. The paranoia thickened. She began to hear footsteps where there were none, to imagine whispers behind closed doors. Once, as she left the workroom carrying folded garments, she swore she heard the overseers laugh low behind her, their voices slithering like snakes. She did not turn, did not falter, but the sound clung to her ears like a threat. She had become both hunter and hunted, her life reduced to the silent duel of eyes and silences. The tension broke one evening when the maid returned, this time with a broom in hand, claiming to be tidying the sewing room. She brushed past Sukey with the arrogance of someone rehearsing her own power, sweeping dust against the table legs, her eyes darting to the basket once more. Sukey felt her stomach twist as the girl's hand reached again, casual and careless, as if fate itself were daring Sukey to act. This time she could not wait for chance. Her hand shot out, quick but gentle, steady as the needle she had mastered. She caught the girl's wrist lightly, her eyes lowered in the posture of respect, and said, "Forgive me, miss, but mistress told me none should touch her things. She'd notice if they were disturbed." The maid froze, her mouth opening with protest. But then her pride bristled at the mention of the mistress. No one wanted the wrath of Mrs. Butler, not even the pettiest servant. The girl yanked her hand free, muttered under her breath, and stormed out. Sukey released her breath slowly, the weight of the moment pressing down until her knees nearly buckled. She had bought herself time, but time was thinning, fraying like the edge of worn fabric. That night, as the coughing in the mistress's chamber tore through the walls like a warning bell, Sukey realized she could not linger in hesitation any longer. The maid's suspicion was a storm cloud swelling above her. The master's gaze was the lightning waiting to strike, and the overseers circled like wolves hungry for prey. The next move had to be decisive, bold enough to shift the balance once more, or the needle that had been her weapon would turn into her shackle, and fate provided her the stage. A grand ball was announced, a gathering of Memphis society meant to flaunt the Butler family's wealth even as its matriarch withered behind closed doors. Garments would be needed, new dresses, new coats, all stitched by the silent hands of the seamstress whose needle had already tasted vengeance. Sukey bowed her head in acceptance, but inside her blood surged with both terror and anticipation. The ball would be her battlefield, and every stitch would be a weapon laid in plain sight. The mansion became a hive of motion in the days leading to the ball. Servants polished silver until it gleamed like cold fire. Candles were ordered by the dozens, barrels of wine rolled across the stone floors. The mistress, pale as ivory and trembling in every step, still insisted on receiving the dress Sukey was tasked to make, for no sickness could keep her from flaunting wealth before Memphis. Society, the master's voice echoed through the halls like thunder, demanding perfection, demanding brilliance, as though a spectacle could disguise the rot that already gnawed at his house. Sukey moved silently through it all, her needle flashing in and out of fabric, her hands steady though her heart beat like a war drum. She stitched with precision born not only of skill, but of vengeance sharpened over months of secrecy. Into the gowns she laced threads coated in poisons ground to invisibility, their bitter scent disguised by beeswax and rose oil. Into the men's vests she worked padding brushed with powders so fine they clung to cloth like shadows. Each garment became a soldier in the silent army she commanded, each seam a blade no eye could see. She handled them with reverence, as though preparing relics for a sacred ritual. And in truth, it was a ritual. The ancestors whispered in the back of her mind, their voices urging her forward, reminding her that patience had carried her this far, and patience would carry her through the storm to come. The night of the ball arrived heavy with heat, the Memphis air thick with the scent of magnolia and sweat. Carriages clattered onto the gravel drive, spilling women draped in silks and men gleaming in polished boots. Laughter rose into the night, the kind of laughter born from arrogance, from people too certain of their place in the world. Inside, the chandeliers blazed, bathing the hall in golden light. Musicians tuned their violins, servants rushed with trays of champagne, and the butlers stood at the entrance to receive their guests, their smiles stretched tight across faces lined with exhaustion. Mrs. Butler wore the gown Sukey had stitched with such deliberate care. It clung to her like a second skin, shimmering with threads that gleamed under candlelight, threads that carried secrets no guest could imagine. Sukey stood in the shadows, her place among the invisible, her eyes wide and unblinking as the hall filled with voices. The music began, and couples swept across the floor, skirts swirling, boots striking in rhythm. For a time, the spectacle dazzled even her, this grand illusion of wealth and power, the illusion her own hands had made possible. And then, the illusion began to fray. It started with a cough sharp and sudden from a man near the punch bowl. He pressed a handkerchief to his lips, his brow damp with sweat. A woman nearby stumbled mid-step, her laughter cutting off as her face paled, her hand clutching at her chest. Another guest faltered, their body folding as though the floor itself had risen against them. The music strained to continue, the violins wobbling as dancers hesitated, eyes darting toward the fallen. Then the first scream cut through the air, high and shattering, and the ball collapsed into chaos. Guests staggered, some collapsing to the floor, others gasping for air as confusion spread like fire. Servants rushed forward, their trays crashing, glasses shattering into rivers of wine and glass. The chandeliers seemed to flicker as if recoiling from the panic, their light swaying across faces contorted with fear. Sukey stood still, her breath caught in her chest, watching as the poisons she had so carefully hidden revealed themselves in writhing bodies and desperate cries. It was not fast, not sudden like the strike of a blade. It was slow, creeping, invisible, a sickness sewn into seams and threads. Mrs. Butler clutched at her bodice, her gown gleaming even as her strength drained. Her cough shook her frail body, her handkerchief spotted with blood. Mr. Butler's voice boomed across the hall, ordering calm, demanding order, but his commands were swallowed by the panic. The ball that was meant to showcase power had become a theater of weakness, and the family stood at its crumbling center. Sukey felt the storm of eyes sweep the room, searching for cause, searching for blame. She pressed herself deeper into the shadows, her heart racing. No one looked to the gowns. No one thought of the seamstress whose hands had shaped them. All eyes were fixed on the bodies faltering in the golden light, on the grotesque dance of sickness that had turned the celebration into a nightmare. For the first time, Sukey allowed herself to breathe, a trembling exhale that tasted of triumph and fear intertwined. Yet even in triumph, danger pressed close. Mr. Butler's gaze, sharp and wild, cut across the hall until it landed on her. For a fraction of a second, his eyes locked with hers, suspicion burning in their depths like embers. It was not proof, not yet, but it was enough to set her blood cold. The storm she had unleashed could not be hidden forever. The ball was collapsing, and with it the walls of secrecy she had so carefully stitched. As the guests cried out and the house drowned in chaos, Sukey knew the night was not her victory. It was her reckoning. The poisons had spoken too loudly, and the master's eyes had heard their whispers. The game of shadows was nearing its end, and the next move would decide not only the fate of the butlers, but of Sukey herself. The chandeliers still rang with the echo of the scream when Mr. Butler's voice cut through the ballroom and sent the overseers lurching toward the shadows where Sukey stood, their boots sliding in a slurry of wine and glass. Bodies sagged against the railings. A gentleman knelt retching into a napkin that bloomed red. The violins had fallen to a thin, frightened drone like insects trapped behind curtains, and in that brittle light the master found her eyes and did not look away. "Come, here," he said, and the two words moved through the crowd like a hooked wire. She stepped forward with the same unhurried grace she had practiced since childhood, the same obedient tilt of the head, and yet the air around her tightened until it felt like a wet rope around her ribs. He brought her into the circle of brightness, the servants watching from the edges as if the floor itself might swallow them for witnessing what came next. He asked nothing about the gowns, nothing about the thread, nothing about the way the mistress clutched her bodice as if her own skin were a dress laced too tight. Instead, he asked if she had touched the wine, if she had handled the trays, if she had spoken to any guest. The questions were a net thrown wide for show. The real hunt was in his eyes, in the way his gaze slid to her workbox set against the wall like a coffin that had forgotten its corpse. "Bring it," he said, and one overseer seized it and set it down hard on the table so the lid jumped. The room leaned closer. A gloved hand lifted the latch. Inside, nothing but needles and shears and spools breathed their clean little lies. Waxed threads nested like pale snakes, a thimble resting like a coin on a grave. The maid with the broom hovered near the master's shoulder, her breath sweet with victory, and whispered about a smell, about a wax, about something that did not belong. Mr. Butler did not look at her. He pulled one spool free and brought it to his nose. He sniffed once, twice, his mouth curving downward as if tasting a joke he did not find amusing, then placed it back with the serenity of a judge who saves his sentence for the gallows. "This is what you do," he said softly, and the softness was worse than thunder. "You stitch, you serve, you do not think. And yet here you stand thinking." The room waited for her voice, and so did she, but none came. In her silence she felt the world lean, and in that lean she felt every secret pocket she had ever sown, every leaf she had learned to name in the dark, every whisper at the fire flicker like a flock taking wing. They moved her then, the overseers, took her by the arms with the formal care of men who prefer their violence in private, steering her through the gold light of the hall into the dim corridor that led to the sewing room. The music behind them died at last, replaced by sobs and the hoarse bark of commands. In the workroom, the lamps burned low. Shadows pooled on the floorboards where sun had once warmed the dust. Mr. Butler closed the door with 2 fingers and stood, a breath away from her, close enough that she saw the sweat glittering in the crease beside his nose. He spoke of loyalty, of the sin of ingratitude, of how the Lord sees all. He spoke of how a house creeps with rot when soft hands forget their place. He spoke to her as if sermon were whip and he expected her to bleed from words alone. Sukey said that the gowns were finished as asked, that she had done what she was told, and with each syllable she felt the thrum of a thread running through her, unspooling from a place deeper than flesh. He told the overseers to search. Drawers opened, lids thumped, the underside of tables were slapped, a chair was turned over so hard a leg cracked. One man pried at the baseboard where the paint lifted like a scab. Another tipped the workbox and spilled its silver teeth across the floor. A needle slid, glinting, then spun to stillness just beside her bare foot. In that bright sliver she saw the whole of her life, a single point that pierced cloth and skin and silence with equal hunger. It was the coughing that opened the door again. Not hands but sound, that raw, tearing sound of a body refusing to be. A body. A girl burst into the room to shriek that the mistress had fallen, that her lips were the color of bruised plums, that guests were fainting in pairs like dancers who had practiced collapse instead of waltz. Chaos flooded the corridor as if the house had been tipped into the river. Mr. Butler spun toward the hall, the overseers with him, and in that pivot, Sukey passed around them like smoke. She knelt as if to gather the spilled tools, her fingers closing around the fallen needle, and in one smooth motion she slipped it into the heel seam of her shoe, where no searching hand would dare. Then she took the workbox under one arm like a child and walked into the boiling music of disaster, her body a perfect shape of purpose hidden beneath obedience. The ballroom had become a field after battle. Women lay against the walls fanning, themselves with limp hands. Men sagged on chairs as if the wood grew soft beneath them. The chandeliers cast light that trembled as though the flames themselves were frightened. Mrs. Butler lay half upon the dais, eyes half open, breath skipping, the gown glittering as if it mocked her. Mr. Butler knelt and shouted her name into the screaming hush, then rounded on the assembled servants with a look so wild it made the room step backward in a single shudder. "Find it," he roared, and the words meant anything and everything. The poison, the devil, the seamstress, the flaw in the world that dared touch his house. Sukey placed her workbox by the door where any hand might claim it, and faded toward the service passage that ran behind the kitchens. At each threshold she met a pair of eyes and left behind a quiet, a hush that was not fear but recognition. A thin cord that ran from mouth to mouth and said go, said now, said the door that you think is a wall can open if you push with the right memory. She reached the laundry, the air wet and sour with steam, the window propped with a spoon. The night tasted of iron and rain. Outside, the garden rolled in velvet darkness, hedges black against a heavier black, the ground softened by the trampling of carriage wheels and the panic of guests. She could disappear in that dark, cut through the magnolias, cross the ditch, find the thicket where the elder had once shown her a plant that burned the tongue and cleared the mind. She could run to the river where men with eyes like hers moved by moon more than by map. She could also stop, and she did. She stopped because the house still breathed, because the crying rose from it like smoke from a kiln, because the needle in her shoe felt suddenly heavy as a key. Footsteps pounded behind her. The maid with the broom, cheeks bright with the heat of someone who thinks she has earned a crown, skidded into the laundry and pointed at Sukey with a hand that shook from triumph. "There!" she gasped. "There she is!" Sukey turned and looked at the girl, really looked, and saw not a hunter but a child playing at power, because power was the only toy she had ever been given. Sukey reached into her apron and drew out nothing more, dangerous than a length of clean thread. She held it up between thumb and forefinger. "This is what I am," she said, her voice low and even. The girl stared. The confidence wavered. The mouth twisted as if searching for the next line that the world had always supplied. Behind her, two overseers appeared, their faces raw with the strain of a night that would not obey. They advanced. The house groaned then, a deep, tired sound as the weight of bodies and fear and heat met in the ceiling. A crystal ring guttered from the chandelier and fell like a bell. In that sound the overseers flinched, the maid flinched, the world flexed. Sukey moved. Not a sprint, not a desperate lunge, just a glide through the window where the spoon tumbled to the sill and clinked once like a coin deciding its side. She dropped to the garden and the hedges swallowed her. Behind her, shouts tangled with prayers. Ahead of her, the night was a book without pages, all thickness and promise. She ran bent low across the lawn, shoes sucking at the damp earth, breath measuring itself to the rhythm of crickets. At the hedge line, she paused and reached down to peel the needle from her shoe. She held it for a long moment, the moon laying a thin edge on the steel, then slid it into the seam of her dress and began to move along the outer wall where vines gripped brick with the patience of the dead. At the corner, she looked back. Through a window, she saw Mr. Butler standing alone for the first time in his life, small as a figure inside a glass, his hand to his mouth as if he could swallow what the night had made. He turned too quickly, staggered, caught himself on the frame and shouted a name that did not cross the lawn. Whether it was hers or his wife's or God's, the wind took it and folded it away. What became of Sukey depends on which voice you choose. Some say the overseers found her by dawn near the far hedge, that she was dragged back and bound and carried toward a tree that had been waiting for her since it was a sapling, that the morning saw a crowd with breakfast on their breath, and a boy who laughed, that the river rose that day for reasons men called weather, while women called sorrow. Others say she crossed the ditch and slid under the cypress where roots make a cathedral, and then walked the riverbank until a skiff found her, that she vanished into a road that is not drawn on any map, that in towns where the air tastes of salt, a dress will sometimes take a woman by the shoulders and lift her chin, as if an old hand had adjusted a collar. In one version, a needle was found on the laundry floor weeks later, stained with something no one could name. In another, the elder woke before dawn and found a needle pressed into his doorframe, bright as a tooth, and smiled so slowly it looked like prayer. What is certain is this: the Butler house never breathed the same again. Chandeliers that once held light like a promise now held it like a warning. Guests avoided the address. Servants moved with a new quiet that was not fear, but calculation. In corners, in kitchens, in quarters, names were said in gratitude that never reached the parlor. Thread and wax and root became a language shared under the tongue. And somewhere, whether in memory or in flesh, a seamstress walked with her back straight and her hands steady, carrying a needle that had learned how to choose its cloth. If this ending gripped you, like this story and subscribe now, so you do not miss the next descent into the darkest corners of history, where the whispers refuse to die.